Hello, everyone. I'm Brent Runyon, Executive Director of the Providence Preservation Society. I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight to all of the above, being different housing needs with different approaches, part of our symposium all about housing. Before we get underway tonight, I want to acknowledge that the Providence Preservation Society is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. Our acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous peoples in this place, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. Our symposium this year explores housing in all its complexity. For most people, housing is both deeply personal and inherently political. Together, we're looking at both dimensions and considering the ways in which preservation can address the housing crisis in Providence and beyond. The final program of the symposium is tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. on preserving workforce housing, something that I think we'll find very relevant here in Providence. Tickets are still available on our website. I hope you'll join us. We are recording this session, as you just saw. I encourage you to enter your questions in the chat box so we can get to them towards the end of the program. I want to thank our many sponsors for supporting this year's symposium, especially our presenting sponsor, Cornish Associates. And this afternoon, we're very pleased to be joined by Shane Phillips, project manager of the UCLA Lewis Center Housing Initiative and author of The Affordable City, Strategies for Putting Housing Within Reach and Keeping It There. Shane will speak for about 45 minutes, leaving time for questions at the end. So we ask you to please have your video and microphone off while he's speaking. If you have thoughts and comments, please put them into the chat box. And at the end of the program, I will sort through them and ask them. We'll try to get to all of them. Thank you, Shane, for your time tonight, and I look forward to your remarks. Turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to everyone here today. I guess I should try to share my screen here first. Make sure this is working. That working all right? Oops. Looks like we're in good shape. Okay, cool.
Well, so, could you put it in? Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Yeah, full screen. Yeah, so thank you again. As you know, the introduction screen about this being personal and political, I think is probably a coincidence, but it suits my own presentation here very well, as I think will become clear. And to kick things off, I'm going to ask kind of throughout this presentation, as people are listening, for everyone here to see yourself as more than just a preservationist, but also as housing advocates, as tenant advocates, and ultimately as people advocates. And that's not a criticism about preservationists. I ask the same thing of people who work in other housing spaces, that we see our role in this as much larger. And my presentation is not going to have a large preservation focus, particularly at the beginning, but I will try to bring it in later after talking about some sort of wider issues. And I want to start by talking about this project here, which is not the most lovely project in the world to me, but it did in some ways motivate me to write my book, The Affordable City. And I really traced it back to this project in some ways. This is a proposed development in Los Angeles, in Hollywood specifically. It goes by the name the Yucca Argyle, just based on its cross streets of Yucca Street and Argyle Avenue. It is, the proposed project is about 200 new units, including 40 reserved for low-income households, being built on private land, private funding, no subsidies whatsoever. A market rate one bedroom, just based on the cost of land and development in the city of LA, is probably going to run at a minimum of $2,500 a month. But those 40 income restricted units would rent for closer to, say, $800 to $1,000 a month, depending on their size and how many people are living in them. That's actually quite a bit less than what many of the 50-year-old apartments in Hollywood rent for. Typical prices for an older one bedroom might be in the $1,500 to $2,000 a month range. And that comparison is important because this project would actually be replacing one of those older apartment buildings, and a relatively large one at about 39 or 40 units that would need to be torn down to make way for this project. So if you're looking at this project from a high level, just kind of 30,000 feet, this is really an objectively good trade. You're taking 40 rent stabilized units, most of which would probably have rents in the $1,200 to $1,500 per month range, and you're replacing them one for one with 40 income restricted units, renting for usually under $1,000 per month. And those units are deed restricted, so they have to remain affordable legally for at least 55 years, whereas rent stabilized units, once someone moves out, they can go back to market rate. So even if they're affordable now, they're probably not going to be for very long if the rest of the market is pretty expensive as it is. Plus, on top of those income restricted units, you're getting 160 market rate units, which help absorb growing demand. They stabilize prices. We have a lot of research on that. They densify the neighborhood, which is good, create new tax revenues. This project is actually just a few blocks from the Red Line subway. Yes, there is a subway in Los Angeles. So it's pretty good for the environment too. This is really exactly the kind of place we want to be building housing. And yet, as this photo shows, the people who live in that 40 unit building put together a really large and effective protest against this project. And I would say a justified one. And I'll explain why. So the problem arises here when we shift our frame away from that citywide or region-wide level and start looking at individual households. So the whole personal aspect of this. Yes, the rent stabilized units would be replaced by more affordable and longer term low income units, and that's a good thing. But it wouldn't usually, for the most part, be the current tenants who benefited. Some tenants would earn too little to be eligible actually for these low income units. Many others would earn too much. And even those who were eligible would be competing in a lottery with hundreds, if not more than 1,000 applicants who want to move into these units just due to the high demand for affordable housing in the city. The rent stabilized tenants who live there now would be evicted. They might receive relocation assistance of up to $20,000, depending on if they're seniors, how long they've lived there, size of their household, these kinds of things. And that might sound like a lot of money. In some respects it is. But if you've lived in this unit for a few decades, you're living on a fixed income and you're paying $800 a month in a unit that on the open market would rent for double that, $20,000 is not going to take you very far. That money's going to run out very quickly. And at the end of the day, a year or two down the road, you're going to be in a much worse place than you started. So the tenants who express their concerns about this project, they're not NIMBYs for doing so. I think they're really justified, and many really are right to be afraid of having their lives irrevocably harmed by this kind of project. And my main takeaway is certainly not this is a bad project. It's really just that depending on your perspective, you can see this as purely bad or purely good. And within the confines of that perspective, you might be right, actually. The region-wide benefits absolutely matter and they're positive, and we need to take those into account in LA and many other cities. We absolutely need a lot more housing, and getting income restricted housing on top of that is wonderful. But those region-wide concerns can't be the only thing we're focused on. We also have to be concerned with how individual people and households are affected. And for those focused solely on the tenants, the reverse is also true. Those region-wide benefits do need to be taken into account. So we have to look at both. We have to take both seriously, and we need to try to maximize those regional benefits while minimizing or ideally eliminating those individual harms. And I think we can get so focused on one or another of these priorities that we can end up scaring away a lot of people who might otherwise be allies. And ultimately, it is a lack of that's going to keep us from making the positive changes that many of us are working toward, whether that's on the tenant side, the pro-housing side, the preservationist side, whatever your specific focus tends to be. So to kind of rephrase this in simpler terms, I think in housing policy, in housing advocacy, we often find ourselves in factions. On the one hand, I think the stereotypical pro-housing advocate sees a project like the Yucca Argyle and focuses on the question of who benefits. And that's a really, really important question to ask, because we do need to be increasing the amount of benefits and improving quality of life over time. On the other side, I think the stereotypical tenant advocate sees something like this and asks who is harmed. And that is an often overlooked question that is also essential. And I want to say, I say stereotypical for both of these advocates, theoretical advocates, because I know many people do ask both of these questions, but this is just sort of to illustrate. And my message in my book, in my advocacy, and running through a lot of my research is that we all need to be asking both of these questions, and that when we do that, better policy and stronger partnerships will naturally follow from that. So this is where in many of my talks, I'll introduce the themes of my book. This is not about my book, but I do think it's helpful as kind of an organizing principle. These are the 3 S's of supply, stability, and subsidy. And another frame that I've heard for this, which I think is just as valid, is production, protection, and preservation. And so actually, maybe that's more suitable for this audience. But broadly, this just means building enough homes for everyone, protecting renters and other vulnerable households in their homes, in their communities, and providing adequate funding for the gaps left by supply policies and stability policies that don't quite get us all the way there, which they often will not. Each of these goals serves a different purpose, and each, I think, has to be a priority for different reasons. I always make a point, and again, this is kind of calling back to the introduction here, that this is a policy statement, but also a political one. I really just don't see how we succeed at building durable and powerful enough coalitions to make positive changes if renters, if young people, lower income households, communities of color, and others feel, often justifiably, that change is a threat to them in some way, to their housing stability or otherwise. And again, it really, in many cases, it often is a threat. So why are we talking about this? Again, recognizing that not everyone here is looking at all of these issues, and that's perfectly fine. Your passion may be preservation, but as everyone here knows, I'm just saying to make sure we're on the same page, cities and towns are more than just the buildings that comprise them. First and foremost, cities are the people who call them home. And if your city is preserving its structures, but losing its people to rising prices, housing instability, and a lack of access to opportunity, my question is, what have we really preserved? And my answer is not nearly enough. In many places, Los Angeles included, but I know this is across the country, especially in coastal areas, we're seeing the built environment change very little, but the incomes of the people moving into a neighborhood are sometimes 2 or 3 times those of the people who already call it home. And it's not the fault of the people moving in. They're not invading or trying to ruin the place, even though there are sometimes challenges that arise from this. But it's really because people want to live in cities, and there's many good reasons to allow people to live in cities, but we're just not making enough space for all the people who want to live in cities. And so we get into these competitions that are sort of unnecessary. And ultimately, I think my message is, preserving neighborhood character doesn't mean much without the neighbors and the characters. So to talk, I apologize for the sniffles I've apparently got here. To talk a little bit about the 3 S's and sort of why I think they are important, why they need to really be paid attention to on their own merits. Starting with supply, this graph here is just a very simple chart of nationwide housing production over the past 60 years or so, adjusted for population. And I think there's a sense in many places that we are in the midst of a housing boom. And what this shows very clearly is that we are not even close. We have been in a 60-year decline, with ups and downs, of course, but the trend is very clearly just less and less housing production. And this is honestly masking a lot of coastal areas that are building not even their fair share among this declining amount. And so clearly there's something going on where we're just not providing enough housing, and something has changed where the supply is falling and falling and falling relative to what we need. And this next image, I think, is really illustrative. This is from a website called BuildZoom. They did these maps for metro areas all over the country. And what we see is our urban areas expanded really dramatically from the 40s through the 70s, in some cases all the way through the 90s. And most of that was dominated by single family housing, detached housing, which we see in the light blue. Those are the light blue spaces. But over time, the dark blue has taken over most of our metro areas. And that represents places that have built essentially no housing during that period. We're doing a lot of preservation actually in the US. It's just mostly single family home neighborhoods, and it's informal. It's not landmarking of truly historic properties. It's just preventing any change in mostly suburbs. At the same time, that lack of building in the suburbs, once they built their single family homes, they're kind of done forever. That's concentrating larger developments in a small area. And you can see over time, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the number of places with the red, this is where 50 plus unit developments are kind of the dominant form. They've been growing in number and in concentration because we focused so much of our growth in these places, really because it's not allowed anywhere else. And to tie this to preservation again, I think it's not a coincidence, and that's part of why we're seeing greater pressure being put on our historic downtowns and other urban areas, central areas that are often kind of the locus for preservation, and for good reason. The places where we want to preserve things are also the only place where it is legal to build more things, and there's something wrong with that. So getting into this just a little bit more on the supply side, supply for me is about acknowledging the physical and economic constraints in the housing market. Ultimately, we can't have affordable and accessible housing for the long term if we don't have enough homes for everyone. I think that's pretty straightforward, fairly uncontroversial. If more people want to move to a place and they have the money to do so, no amount of wishing otherwise will keep them out. And we've seen that time and time again. A lot of cities have tried over the past 50 years and failed. And honestly, keeping them out shouldn't be our goal anyway. At the same time, on the economic side, scarcity empowers landlords at the expense of tenants. It empowers home sellers at the expense of home buyers. And growing demand for a city is good. I think that reflects well on a city, but we want that demand to manifest as increased production and availability and accessibility of housing and more access to jobs and amenities, not as rising prices on a relatively fixed supply of homes, which is what we're actually seeing in many, many parts of the country. In terms of what supply policies actually look like, these are things like zoning reforms to increase density, floor area, and height that can be built, allowing residential uses in commercial zones, which is often prohibited, even if the commercial areas are not like industrial kind of uses that are actually noxious, eliminating or reducing parking requirements, which spread out housing, increase car dependence, make places more polluted and so forth, and more expensive, speeding up development approvals, things of that nature. For all of the three S's, supply, stability, and subsidy, I think it's important to acknowledge what they can and can't do. Kind of the whole message here is that different policies serve different needs in different constituencies. So, supply can absolutely make things better. It can stabilize prices at both a neighborhood and a regional level, create new resources, including low-income units and affordable units, but also new tax revenues, give space for ground floor retail and restaurants and things of that nature. And at a fundamental level, the most fundamental level, we need it as a place to live, as shelter. But on the other hand, housing operates slowly and imprecisely by itself. It's not going to turn a very expensive city into a very affordable city. Developers, especially when we rely on the private market alone, are not going to build their way into prices that are half what they are today. That's just not a realistic expectation, even if they can keep things, make things a little bit better. And nor will supply generally, without subsidies, serve low-income households directly. Just the cost of new things, not just housing, but cars and many other things, is really just too high for low-income households to afford it without some kind of support. It's absolutely essential. I guess this is my overall message, is that supply is absolutely essential, but it's not enough by itself. And I think the Yucca Argyle case demonstrates that it can be accompanied by harms that we do need to take seriously. Moving on to stability, I like to frame this as a question first. And the question is, without policies that support stability, especially for renters, what do we have to offer to renters? And I think the answer right now is pretty bleak. And this is not actually new. It's just something I think we're becoming more and more aware of. Renters have to look forward to rising rents, often restricted by nothing except what the market will bear. They have the possibility of eviction at pretty much any time for any reason. There are no prospects for wealth creation through appreciation of their home or even just the forced savings aspect. And because prices are rising faster than wages, there is a diminishing chance of even escaping renting into home ownership, which has, I think, traditionally been the way we think of renting, unfortunately. And so to put an even sharper point on this question, I think we have to ask ourselves whether renters have the same moral worth as homeowners. I think the answer should be that they do. I think the answer in practice is that we don't think they do. We don't act as though they do. We treat them as second-class citizens who only gain their full rights through the acquisition of real estate. And I think that's really problematic. So supply is about responding to physical and economic realities. For me, stability is about meeting our moral obligations. I don't think a person should lose their home simply because they have the bad luck, if you want to call it that, to live in a gentrifying neighborhood. The corollary of that is that a property owner, a landlord, for example, shouldn't be able to claim all of the upside if their property happens to be in a gentrifying neighborhood. Whether implicit or explicit, I think there's a belief among many people that when home values go up, that is attributed to the intelligence, the good sense, the smart investment of the property owner. But at the same time, I think we all know that luck plays a huge role in all of this. Someone who moved to Palo Alto to become a teacher in 1970 was probably not even thinking about home appreciation. And now their home is worth $3 million versus the same person in very similar circumstances who moved to Cleveland at the same time to become a teacher, and their home was worth essentially nothing. That's not, you didn't earn that, is basically, I guess, the point I'm getting to with all of this. It's, getting back to the renter, it's not the fault of a renter that demand spiked in their neighborhood. And frankly, it wasn't caused by any individual landlord either. Maybe a few exceptions like the Hudson Yards mega development in New York and that kind of thing. So I think there's a role for government to play in moderating how these changes impact both parties. Not to say that the government needs to control all of it, but there's some role there for moderating things. Stability policies, again, I'm not going to get into the deep end with all the policies, because I know that's not really our purpose here. I'm trying to keep things sort of high level, but just so you have a sense for what I'm talking about with stability policies. I mean things like rent control or rent stabilization more realistically, which is sort of a softer version, displacement protections and mitigations like just cause eviction regulations, right to return policies, relocation assistance, prohibiting source of income discrimination, which is basically those signs that say, or the ads that say no Section 8. In many places that is now illegal, and it has increased access to housing for people who rely on that pretty significantly. So those kinds of things. Again, what can and can't be achieved by stability policies? Stability policies of these kinds protect millions of households here in the US and around the world, shielding them from rising rents, illegitimate evictions, and so on, But I think it's important to acknowledge that they don't actually make things more affordable. They just keep things from getting worse as rapidly. And that's absolutely an important goal, but it's why stability policies are not enough by themselves either. The fact that things like tenant protections don't actually make things better it's not a problem. It's not a knock on them. The problem is when we try to enact them thinking that it is going to solve the underlying issue, which ultimately it can't do, at least not by itself. Okay, so on to subsidies, and this one's quick. Subsidies are a tool to apply where supply and stability policies fall short. This includes a raft of programs like housing choice vouchers, low-income housing tax credits for nonprofits to build housing, public housing built and owned directly by the government, acquiring and preserving older, more affordable homes to keep them affordable. Subsidies also run the other way, which I think is important to acknowledge, with things like the mortgage interest tax deduction, which amounts to tens of billions of dollars given away by the federal government every year, almost entirely to affluent households and homeowners specifically, with the end result being actually higher property values that make homeownership less accessible. So we spend tens of billions of dollars to subsidize relatively affluent households to make housing less expensive. It's not the best policy, but that is what a lot of our subsidy dollars are going toward right now. Again, in terms of what subsidies can and can't do, they also help millions and millions of Americans with their housing needs, many of whom would just never be able to afford a home on the open market without some kind of assistance. But they can't assist everyone. I think, you know, we fail to provide, when we fail to provide enough housing through supply policies and keep people stably housed through stability policies, the number of people who need assistance keeps growing, and the cost of helping each person increases as well. To use LA, because there are so many examples of what not to do here, we are building a lot of supportive housing for homeless residents here. And when we passed a bill or a funding measure just, I think 4 or 5 years ago, I guess it was November of 2016, $1.2 billion to fund affordable housing, specifically for formerly unhoused residents. The estimated cost per unit at that time was around $350,000. Now, just 4 years later, we're spending upwards of $400,000, $500,000 on average per unit, and that's just in 4 years. And so we haven't addressed the bigger issue of supply. So all housing and land keeps getting more expensive, and the cost to build each of these supportive housing units is going up and up. And because the housing market overall has not been addressed, the number of homeless people has actually increased, even as we've spent so much more on trying to address the problem. It's a really good illustration, actually, of how all of this intersects. So overall, I think, you know, my message is that none of these stands on their own. I guess you could think of them sort of as a three-legged stool, although I feel like that metaphor is a little overplayed. But supply without stability can mean unnecessary displacement, as we talked about with the Yucca Argyle. Without subsidy, it means poor households will just be left behind. Stability without supply and without subsidy is honestly just managed decline. It's not progress, it's not making things better. Subsidy without supply, as I mentioned, will lead to rising costs, and subsidy without stability will lead to many people needing assistance who might not have needed it otherwise because they wouldn't have been pushed out of their home. Okay, so I've said very little about preservation overall. I'll try to get into this a little bit because I do think this fits in interesting ways. I'll again take some examples from Los Angeles here. You know, we have the classics of preservation, like our Union Station, like the Eastern Columbia building, and you're actually looking right down there on Broadway where there's a lot of other historic buildings and theaters. And we have the kind of more unusual, like Watts Towers, which is also landmarked, and the flat out weird but lovely, like Randy's Donuts. And we have places that actually aren't historic landmarks, but like Vermont Knolls here, which I think maybe should be. I don't think I'm going to be breaking any new ground here. This has probably been covered, and this list could be a lot longer if I took some time to fill it out. But what preservation can do for housing affordability, accessibility, stability, it can do a lot. Provide incentives or mandates to maintain older, more affordable homes. It can encourage the adaptive reuse of kind of older and underutilized uses, commercial uses, for example, and convert them to housing. In many cases, it can serve and often does serve as the core around which neighborhoods can grow and evolve, which I think is a good juxtaposition and complementarity there. And it can save money and greenhouse gas emissions, really importantly, by making use of existing infrastructure rather than building new. And that's the infrastructure that's in the ground, but also the buildings themselves. But there are tensions as well. And I don't know how much this has been covered. I'm sure I'm not the first person to talk about this, but just as supply, supply without stability, stability without subsidy, subsidy without supply, all of these can cause as many problems as they solve. Preservation, I think, as an isolated practice, without any respect or attention for its impacts on other priorities, can also cause harm. This is just, working in silos always has its issues, and we need to find ways to move beyond that. And the best example I have here in Los Angeles that I've been following for quite a while is the Chili Bowl restaurant that is now a sushi restaurant, but still a bowl. The photo here is a former Chili Bowl restaurant. It's part of a chain that existed back in the day. And I'm not sure how many buildings they had. I think at least a dozen, maybe in the dozens. And it was defined really by this sort of circular design that you can see here. But we can also see is that it's no longer a Chili Bowl in anything but form. This business has since moved, but it was most recently a sushi restaurant, actually, that amazingly charged about $250 per person for a meal. Interesting site for it, but apparently they were very successful, and they've moved to a location a little closer to the beach. So I want to share a few other photos. So this is from one angle. This is the Chili Bowl building itself. This is right behind it, the auto yard that is on the same parcel. It's not even like the parcel behind it. And then the street, which is sort of the busy, ugly, typical Los Angeles arterial road where this is located. So in 2019, the owner of this property proposed a development to tear this down and replace it with 24 homes, including several reserved for extremely low income households, meaning 30% of the area median income or below. We're talking someone earning, $20-ish thousand a year, extremely poor, especially for a place like Los Angeles. It was only after the development application had been filed that a neighbor filed to have this property designated as a historic landmark, which would, kill the development, make it really essentially infeasible, and ultimately cost 24 households a place to live in one of the most undersupplied and unaffordable cities in the country. It's now almost 2022, and the historic designation is still undetermined. City Council actually a few months ago just voted to reject the landmarking, but our local preservation organization is threatening to sue over a technicality of how the public meeting was conducted. And I realize I am talking to folks who are probably more inclined than most to see the value in keeping this building as it is, and I respect that. But I do think there is something wrong with how this all works just in practice, whether this building deserves to be preserved or not. More and more, preservation is being proposed only in response to the threat of change. Not only, but very often. And worse, I think that it's being proposed in response to changes that would often accommodate poorer households and households of color who have traditionally been excluded from higher opportunity areas. And I think it's, in some sense, it's entirely understandable that you would only see some of these landmarking proposals after a building is threatened. I think, people often just don't think to try to preserve something until it is threatened. And I think that's, I don't want to dismiss that at all. But here in Los Angeles, at least, we've definitely been seeing historic designation proposals in greater number and on, I think, flimsier and flimsier grounds, from historic gas stations was one proposal, to parking structures, to entire neighborhoods, almost always very wealthy, trying to, and with the explicit, like it's in their documentation, trying to exempt themselves from state laws like our accessory dwelling unit laws, or SB 9, which allows essentially fourplexes in most single family neighborhoods, trying to get themselves out of being subject to these new laws that are trying to address our housing crisis. And as someone who sees great value in preservation, it's getting harder and harder for me to tell the difference between genuine concern for a place's history and cynical efforts to keep my city and many others unaffordable and inaccessible to all but the wealthiest. And I worry that if that distinction continues to be blurred, that is going to be a threat to housing preservation efforts generally. And one last note I did want to make on this chili bowl is that there are actually 4 others like it. There are 4 other of these buildings in Los Angeles already. So it's not actually super unique even in that respect. So fitting all of this into kind of a bigger framework, I apologize that these first 2 in particular will be a little bit of admonition, but I'm going to try to turn this into a more positive and constructive direction very quickly. But I think these are important questions, and I won't pretend to know Providence's context here, but I suspect some of this will resonate with folks. So the first question is, or recommendation, whatever you want to call it, is picking your battles. There's a lot worth preserving, and asking the question of, is this hill worth dying on, I think is worthwhile. And I've seen that question being asked less and less here in Los Angeles, and it's troubling. Maybe even bigger is considering one's allies. We have a few just explicitly NIMBY and frankly borderline segregationist organizations in this region who are very clearly proposing some of these landmark designations to stop new housing from being built. It's always in response to a proposal to build, and it's being proposed by organizations with very clearly cynical motivations. And I won't pretend that there's an easy solution to this, because some of the things they propose to be preserved actually are worthy of it. It's just something to keep in mind. To make this a little more constructive, as I said, I think it's really important that we all ask how we got here, and why, when there are so many places that housing could be built, even if it requires tearing something down, why it's being proposed on places that often do have genuine historical value and maybe worthy of landmarking. Why are they being proposed on those sites? So thinking about some kind of non-preservation advocacy that can still lead to preservation outcomes. I think preservation can't just be a purely defensive effort. And I think that's often how it works. And again, I understand the reasons for that. I don't think, I think it's sort of, there's just too many places that could be eligible. And so, I can see why someone might wait until there is a threat to a building to then move forward with the landmarking, unless it's just, one of the dozen or so, or 100, or however many places that everyone can agree without question that it's historical and deserves to be preserved. I think preservation advocates have to work with allies in the housing justice movement and housing advocacy and policy generally to answer the question, if we want to preserve some places, what other places are we willing to change? And what policies will we support to encourage change in those places so that it doesn't happen on the places we do want to preserve. Going back to that map of development since the 1940s, in your part of the country, a lot of proposals to demolish or change potentially historic buildings came because the places with old buildings are often the only places it's illegal to construct new buildings other than single unit detached homes out in the suburbs, exurbs, agricultural lands, and so forth. So we have to ask, if we don't want it here, where should the capacity for new housing go? Where should we be building homes to ensure that new growth can be accommodated somewhere and in ways that don't threaten our historic buildings and neighborhoods? I think there's real truth to this idea, and it really applies within the preservation space, that if everything is a priority, nothing is. And so we have to figure out what is prioritized and where we're actually okay with some history being lost, or where, maybe a better way of putting it is there's not much history there, or not much unique about it. And so we're okay with this changing pretty significantly so that this other place can stay the same. And I don't want to make this a one-way street. I think at the same time, other housing policy interest groups, YIMBYs, tenant advocacy groups, for-profit and nonprofit developers, community-based organizations, they all need to work with preservationists to answer the question of what places are most valuable in their current form and should we protect. Just to kind of summarize this a little bit, I think preservation without a vision for the future can and sometimes will lead to stagnation, and it may end up prioritizing the fate of buildings over the fate of people. And I don't think that's a place that any of us wants to be. And so we have to think about how we can have a vision for the future at the same time as we're caring about that past. And I think city planning, without a sense for the places we hold dear and what we want to preserve, risks squandering that history and the qualities that make a place worth calling home. So again, I want to really acknowledge this is a two-way street and not try to be too critical of preservationists in particular, because I think we all have some widening of our perspective to do, and just some personal reflection, I guess. So at the beginning, I said the three S's are sort of a policy statement, but also a political one. And so I want to bring this all together within, or just kind of summarize within that framework. I think on the policy side, it's very clear, and we have countless examples of this, that no individual policy or program can solve all our problems. If you've spent any time in kind of the wider world of housing advocacy, you have heard the words, there is no silver bullet, and that is extremely accurate, especially in housing. It is just too complicated. There are too many factors at play. History is too long. A single-minded focus on any one thing will almost always cause some problems in another domain. And then complementary policies, this is sort of the corollary, complementary policies and programs are going to be needed to benefit different groups and protect those most vulnerable to harm. On the politics side, I don't think any individual interest group is influential enough by themselves to reshape housing policy, but multiple interest groups in partnership can be. And I'll be happy to talk about, in the questions, some examples of that. I think Seattle is a really good one where, they haven't done everything perfectly, but they brought together a big coalition and they've made a lot of progress on many different fronts by bringing those groups together and kind of taking that holistic and comprehensive approach and not dismissing anyone at any time. And so just to spell this out a little further, I think this means preservationists working with tenant groups, YIMBYs, developers, community-based organizations, faith groups, others, anyone engaged in housing policy, and seeing how they can come to agreement to the extent possible and work together, because they're going to be a lot more powerful, a lot more influential together than apart. I often close out my presentations with this quote, and it is clearly about zoning. Zoning is a means by which a governmental body can plan for the future. It may not be used to deny the future, to avoid the increased responsibilities and economic burdens which time and natural growth invariably bring. But I think if you just replace zoning with historic preservation, it works pretty much just as well. So I decided to keep it. I hope it makes sense. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and happy to answer questions. I made a point to put our UCLA Housing Voice at the bottom there. That's actually a podcast that we started about 6 months ago, and release an episode every 2 weeks on a different topic. And we really kind of dive into different aspects of housing policy, from fair housing to parking requirements to market rate to value capture. We cover a lot. And so if you're interested in learning more, I think that might be a good place to start. Thanks.
Wow, round of applause. Shane, I really appreciate how many complex ideas you injected into a very concise presentation. You answered quite a few of my questions about were you considering income disparity, which you did, and you're also quite fair to preservation. And I think I say fair because many of the things you talked about are things that we've spent a year wrestling with in our strategic planning process. Our strategic plan came out today. It's on our website. I encourage people to check it out. But we started by doing a racism, implicit bias training last year. And the 2 questions they encouraged us to ask when we thought about programs or advocacy is who benefits and who is harmed. And so that has really become the core of even our special events. So from every aspect of our organization, we've got a lot of work to do. And I'm sure we'll step on some landmines, but I appreciate you bringing those 2 questions up, because we are centering those in our work now.
That's great.
We have quite a few questions, but before we move to those, I wonder, I would love for you to elaborate on your example of Seattle and how preservation has been a partner in some of these larger issues.
Well, I'll say I don't know preservation's specific role. I'm thinking just kind of bigger picture, how about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, they brought together roughly 30 different organizations, representatives of organizations, just all across the spectrum, from tenant advocates to landlords, from nonprofit and for-profit developers, housing justice, community-based organizations, faith groups, architects, and I'm pretty certain the local preservation organization as well. And they came up with, over a year-long period, about, I think it was around 65 different recommendations. And 5 years later, I just read a sort of retrospective on the successes and failures of that. And it was not, perfect. Not everything came through. There were, as you say, some landmines that were stepped on, and some 1 step forward, 2 steps back situations. But 5 years later, they did end up enacting most of their policies in some form or another, or were in progress on them. And that alone is a huge accomplishment. And I'll say Seattle on the building side is building at a higher rate than almost anywhere in the country, at least among big cities. Mm-hmm. And they still are struggling because there's so much pressure on them because of Amazon and Google, and just a lot of high income people moving there, and it's hard to keep up. But they've done a lot, and that coalition, the fact that they brought all those groups together, I think, and people I know from there tell me that they were able to maintain that through an organization called Seattle for Everyone, if I'm remembering correctly. That group was able to continue to push for these things. So it wasn't just they came up with these ideas and they went on a shelf. It was part of the coalition building was actually, how are we going to not just come up with good ideas, but continue to push for them to be implemented? And I think they've done a pretty good job overall. I'm from Seattle originally, actually, and I kind of wonder how people who do preservation as a job, or it's like their main passion, how they feel about Seattle's approach. They do a lot of the like facade retention on single story brick buildings, but then they build them up bigger. I think
Right.
a lot of them turn out really well, but I'm sure that's a controversial
It's very
approach in
controversial.
some respects. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think they do a pretty good job. And I'll say, coming from Los Angeles, I think the architecture in Seattle is a lot better than what we're doing here right now.
Yeah, well, it is interesting. You pointed out that kind of ubiquitous LA streetscape, which I remember seeing a lot of. And I think, you know, one of the pushbacks by preservationists or people who use preservation as a cudgel is somewhat about change, is somewhat about the type of people who might be moving in. Usually it's about more cars and parking issues,
Right.
Traffic, but it's also often about the aesthetics and things being built today. You know, people just either you like it or you don't. Most people don't, from what I can tell. So I think a lot of it is just aesthetics. That first picture you put up, I think, would get a lot of pushback in all areas of Providence.
Yeah.
But
Not much different here, I'm sure. We're not big fans of a lot of this stuff either. Yeah.
Right. It seems like, you know, in Providence, there's a study on our North Main Street, which is a major north-south route. 55 acres of surface parking lots exist. And I know LA has a lot of parking lots. Most cities do. Why do we need to tear things down to build new housing? Isn't there enough room?
Well, first, there's not enough room.
Okay.
Even if we built all of those parking lots into, you know, big buildings with a lot of housing, it wouldn't be enough. It might be enough for a year or two if we could get all of those built. But the thing about cities is they keep changing. And, you know, it's something that frustrates me when I hear people say, like, this is a very common line and it's masking a lot of nuance and there's just some flat out incorrect assumptions about this. But when people say there are more vacant units in Los Angeles or name your city than there are people living on the street, unhoused. And in a very technical sense, that is true. But assuming it were even possible to move every single unhoused person into all of those vacant units, and ignoring the fact that many of those vacant units are literally just between tenants, they're not, you know, vacant for long. But even if you could do that, the problem is we are generating tens of thousands of homeless people every year. Many of them get back into housing at some point, but you move everyone into a home, but then what happens to all the people who continue to become homeless because you're not actually building more? And I think a similar argument holds for building on parking lots and things like and public land and this kind of thing. Like, I think we should absolutely prioritize those places, and it's also why I don't think focusing all development on like commercial corridors is a good idea, because it's sort of segregating people into the most polluted parts of our city. But I think there is a role for it. And a nice thing about building on the corridors, beyond the fact that it's often one of the more accessible places, like there might be a bus line or a rail line right nearby. Another benefit is you're not displacing current tenants in most cases, maybe commercial, but you're at least no one's losing their home out of the deal. And, just to close this idea out, I think there is a challenge, and something I've been thinking a lot about is a lot of development is just happenstance. It's the owner of a property decides this is the moment where I either want to sell. Maybe the owner dies and their kids want to get rid of it, or the owner's like, I need money, or they just decide I don't want to deal with it anymore, and like the passive income is not what I'm looking for. So many different reasons that properties end up being sold, and that sale is usually what leads to the development. And there's just no good way to like force the highest priority right, or the least disruptive places. I won't say there's no way at all. You can incentivize it. You could possibly mandate it or penalize people for it. I'm fine with. I'll say it, like a land value tax is one option here, where like if you own a parking lot in downtown, in California, we have something called Prop 13. So a lot of these parcels are paying way below what they're worth. Like a parking lot might be worth $10 million to a developer, but they're paying taxes as though it's worth 100,000.
Oh yeah,
and so
same
they can
here.
just hold on to it indefinitely.
Right.
And so, this is sort of the subsidy side. not the spending side, but the taxing side, there are things we can do on that front to actually encourage certain types of properties turning over and becoming, their higher and better use. And so that's one option. But anytime you're dealing with property taxes, it gets dicey.
It does. It does. Yeah. Speaking of, you can't force people. We had a mayor at one point for many years who I think was very effective at putting deals together using promises and threats, and not on the whole great legacy, but he did see a lot of things getting done that were more positive, I think, in some regards.
Yeah.
We have a question from Elizabeth Watson about is comprehensive planning regarded as the playing field where all of these competing priorities are worked out? How do you see comprehensive planning being used?
So I'm going to make some assumptions about what is meant by that, but so you just mentioned a former mayor being good at making deals, and I kind of bit my tongue because what I wanted to say was I think relying on deal making is part of our problem, where everything is negotiated ad hoc.
Yes, I agree.
And not only is that just a huge burden in terms of like staff time and everything like that, it's just hard to process enough projects doing that. It's also a great, and maybe this is the mixed legacy, it's a great invitation for corruption, where things are being negotiated behind closed doors. We are now on our third city council member out of 15 in Los Angeles who may be going to prison, 2 of them for development related issues. And it's because in large part, we have a very discretionary process. And this is where I think comprehensive planning, community planning, whatever you want to call it, is really, really important, where instead of sort of we tend to set our zoning and other rules at a very restrictive level with the intent of bargaining them away, which will either lead to actual corruption or at the very least the appearance of it. And what I would really like to see is for us to actually plan for how we want our communities to look without the intention of bargaining it away, like actually say what we want it to look like. And if a developer shows up and offers something that complies with those rules, they just get to build it. There's no negotiation. Maybe you have some, there needs to be some consideration, for example, for if the property should be demolished or should be preserved. I think there can be a role for design review, though that has issues as well. But generally, I think we need to spend a lot more time and money and resources and do a lot more outreach on that step, on helping the entire community create a vision for what it should look like. And then once that vision is created, we stick with it and just let projects that comply with it go forward rather than the project by project, which, invites NIMBYism, invites, more privileged groups to exert their will and push development elsewhere, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, other than subsidy, the thing developers want most is certainty, and right, they don't want to run up against unexpected obstacles. So yeah, I agree. I have a question from Jim. This goes back sort of similar along the idea of transit corridors, but also central business districts where we have all these one-story commercial assemblages without residential components. Do you consider that a squandering of opportunity to build new housing?
I mean, yes, I think there's a lot of opportunity in places like that. And as we were talking about a little earlier, it's just a question of how you incentivize those properties to be the ones that turn over. And, I think there's a lot of ways you can do that. The tax structure is one, but also making sure that, on some of these places, maybe what you can build is only a little bit bigger actually than what is there right now. We have that problem in a lot of Los Angeles corridors because of a ballot initiative from 35 years ago, where we have all these strip malls next to sometimes 40-story towers that were built prior to this initiative. And you could replace the strip mall with like a 2-story building, but that's it. And it doesn't make sense to tear down a 1-story building to replace it with 2. It's just financially the opportunity cost, the construction and demolition. And so thinking about that is certainly part of this. I will acknowledge though that there's still the problem of if just region-wide, scarcity is a big problem, so that land values are increasing pretty rapidly, even if you own that 1 or 2 story building in downtown, you know, the value of it is all land. It's the potential for redevelopment. But if you wait another 3 years, it's probably going to be worth even more. And so somehow breaking that, where this expectation that property values will keep climbing faster than inflation, that almost has to be part of this. Otherwise, as a property owner, unless I need the money now, why not just keep collecting my passive income and wait to sell it for even more at some future date?
Are there policies around, you mentioned taxes on parking, are there, I think I've heard of something called like value of developable land. So if a parcel is zoned for 10 stories and you tax it on that rather than the single story, are those?
Yeah, that's basically a land value tax.
Land value tax, okay.
Yeah. Which has a storied history starting with Henry George, or at least popularized by Henry George in the 1870s, I believe, but has very limited implementation here or elsewhere in the world. I think in part just because, I don't know what it is, but people get very defensive about property taxes. It's sort of like gas taxes, where you're like, this is a good tax, like it's taxing a bad thing. And property taxes are a wealth tax. They kind of discourage the hoarding and underutilization of land. And yet something about them just really rubs people the wrong way. And so shifting to a different model is a real challenge. And, you know, I think it's why Prop 13 here in California, that weird tax rule I was talking about, and in Rhode Island, sounds like it has something similar. I know other states do as well. It's just tough politically.
Oh, it really is, yeah. I probably have maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So Edgar asked a question: do you advocate for development agencies that help mediate these often conflicting and divergent needs and aspirations? Now, I don't know, Shane, does your organization do advocacy?
I mean, as an organization, not really, but as individuals, we certainly do. It's an interesting question. I'll say, I mean, the short answer is not really. But that's not to say that I don't think there can be a role for that, especially on the preservation side. I will say Los Angeles has tried to do something interesting where it's called Survey LA, where they basically went around, I'm not sure if it was in person or on Street View or what, but they went around the whole city and designated different parcels as potentially historic and as like maybe worthy of further investigation. And in theory, that is really smart. And I think having these kinds of inventories is really good. As you said, if a developer or property owner knows, like, okay, my property is historic, I can only do these things with it, that's much better than finding that out after, you know, they sell it, developer paid millions of dollars, and then they realize they've lost millions of dollars because they can't actually use the property for anything different. So it's better to know in advance. In practice, it has run into challenges where they've just covered huge swaths of the city as potentially historic, and that's being treated as requiring all this extra process and injected a huge amount of uncertainty onto many of the properties that are under that header, even though it's not an official designation and has no like technical legal control. But I think there is something to that idea. It's just the implementation is everything. But inventories of that sort, I think, are a good place to start.
Yeah, and as I think so, Elizabeth maybe pointed out, there hasn't been a lot of money for those kinds of surveys since the 70s. Yeah. Well, final question is one that I had when you showed your chart of housing production per capita over time. Have you ever seen another time in our history where there is this kind of disparity in production and need and income and like all these different factors that you talked about? And if so, what was done to address it? Was there a major federal program or anything else?
I guess maybe the best example I can think of, and I'm not an expert on this history at all, is World War II. When we had big shifts in population of people working in Los Angeles included to work at, the factories and the ports and things like that. And the government did step in and build a lot of housing directly. And some of it was temporary and became permanent. Some of it was temporary and got torn down later. It faced a lot of opposition from private interests, investors, developers, and so forth, which is unfortunate, but not surprising. And I absolutely think there's still a role for government like that. I think it can be a combination. It can be, building housing directly for sure, but also just, incentivizing it in various ways, including just through, favorable financing. Something I think is overlooked actually is how important different tax structures are to all of this. In I think 1981 or 1982, during the Reagan administration, there was their first tax bill, which was like a big tax cut, and it made multifamily rental housing development very lucrative. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of units were being built every year, a really large increase from prior. And then in 1986, they changed like the depreciation schedule on multifamily housing, like this very, esoteric thing that no one but an accountant or an investor would ever pay attention to, and housing production cratered. And so these little things really do make a big difference. It's just a matter of finding those pinch points. And I do think, unfortunately, cities through their focus on local control and like, we know what's best. Sorry, something's popping up on my screen. It's this sort of challenge where everywhere is trying to look out for themselves and not thinking about the region, the state, the country, and what's best for people generally. And so there's been increasing amounts in many places of state intervention and saying like, sorry, we're not going to allow you to have complete control of this anymore because we've seen the result. It's you keep everyone out and don't want to build any housing. And when everyone's doing that same thing, it causes real big problems nationwide. And so, states are stepping up. I think the federal government has yet to do that, but they're certainly talking about it in encouraging ways in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is sort of living up to the mandates of the Fair Housing Act from more than 50 years ago. They're actually talking about the role of zoning and the ways that cities prevent new housing from being built. And of course, the infrastructure bill, I'm not sure what's in the infrastructure bill specifically, but the Build Back Better had at least a lot of money for housing in different forms. So I think there's a role there for sure. And I'm hoping that it can increase. And it's just going to be a mix of what can the market do for people who the market can serve, and can we step up on the public side to help the people who the market will not be able to serve. It's really, both and approach.
Thank you for bringing a really high level and complicated subject to us in a meaningful way that I think we can all understand. And I hope people will not only find your book, but also listen to the blog. I certainly intend to subscribe. The final question before we let you go is, the place you've got on your screen is a place zoning probably would not allow in most cities these days. But softball question, what is this magical place?
I actually sometimes have a little note there. This is Philadelphia. And actually, yeah, I mean, this is the nice thing about the East Coast. You all have some really beautiful neighborhoods. This is Boston, so right north of you. So
yeah.
We don't have places like that in LA or really the West Coast generally, so I have to bring them into my presentations to make me feel better.
Right, thanks. We appreciate it. Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for your time and for sharing everything tonight.
I appreciate it. Thank you.